Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Tim, welcome to the podcast. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for having me here.
Mate, thanks for reaching out. So we were kind of on the run-up to UKRO when we kind of first made our connections, because you've been involved in some really interesting work, working with the NFCC first and foremost, but then UKRO and the College of Paramedics and the Faculty of Prehospital Care, unless it's not completely obvious that I've just read that bit, because I was never going to remember that last bit. And you're working on some evidence-based guidelines around extrication and patients trapped in motor vehicles. So I just wanted to, before we jump into that, what's your kind of background and why have you had such an interest in trying to get in, getting a little bit further and advancing this type of work in the sector?
So my background is I'm a medic. I'm a doctor. I've got a really nice, I guess you call it portfolio or balanced career job. So I work part of the time in a major trauma centre as an emergency medicine consultant based in the southwest of the UK. I work part of the time doing clinical care on an air ambulance. So that's the Devon air ambulance, where I'm also their medical director, their clinical lead. So I've got kind of other leadership and other type responsibilities. And I do a bit of, I guess you'd call it academic work like this around the edges of those jobs. So I've been doing pre-hospital care since probably around about 2005, and I've worked on helicopter emergency medicine platforms since 2006, 2007, something like that. So over that time, I've been involved in many extrications, seen many people injured following motor vehicle collisions, and realised kind of over time, through some really sad cases actually. So seeing people who should have survived die whilst they're in the car, seeing people die whilst they're under my care on the way to hospital, just wishing we'd got there half an hour earlier. And then as a trauma team leader and involved with trauma systems in hospital, seeing people pass away due to almost the secondary effects of their primary injury, which perhaps could have been alleviated if we'd got them to hospital a little bit quicker.
Hey folks, I wanted to jump in here and just share with you a really exciting update from our partner William Wood Watches. They are launching the first ever field watch collection. Now it's named Fearless, which firstly, absolutely love, and this new collection is very different from anything they've ever launched before. However, you will see that they've managed to maintain some of the signature William Wood Watch elements. The big thing for me is that black fire hose. So they have got, the first ever time they've done this, the black fire hose strap and a really, really cool case back. So now the watches are available in 3 colors this time. These are red, orange, which is my favorite, and the yellow. Each watch features those straps that are made up from repurposed black fire hose. That stuff looks the absolute bee's knees, guys. They've never done that one before, so go and take a look at that. And they've also got a textured dial to represent charcoal. Honestly, I never know how they're going to keep going deeper with this. Every time they do, I'm like, where are they getting this from? But I know where they're getting it from, because they're speaking to the boots on the ground. They're speaking to you, they're speaking to me, they're speaking to firefighters and frontline operators and getting just these amazing insights. The creativity in this is amazing. Now, the case has come down in size from 41mm to 40mm. And another new thing is they've got a unique firefighter helmet visor case back. So flip it on the back. In fact, go over to the website and you'll see the photos. That visor case back, guys, it just looks absolutely incredible. Now, the watches are available to buy immediately, like right now, and they can be delivered within 24 hours in the UK and 48 hours from UPS collection in the US. The link to William Wood Watches is in the notes below this episode. You will not regret it. I am 100% putting this on my list. I'm going to be nagging them like crazy because I know you can pay in 3 stages as well. You haven't got to go in full whack on this. The new Fearless collection, William Wood Watches. Go check it out. How on earth did you carve out such an awesome niche? Because I know, firstly, like there's several aspects there. I mean, you've been doing the heli stuff for 15 years now, and I know that is a very sought after role. And also you get such a beautiful balance of being able to do some in-hospital work, but still being out there at the sort of coalface. How did you, I just want to pause for a second there and understand and appreciate how difficult it is to get into that position, because I know there's hundreds of paramedics, my brother-in-law being one of them, who would certainly aspire to get to a role where you kind of are. So if you could just give us a whistle-stop tour of how you managed to do that. I imagine it wasn't blind luck.
So I'd always been interested in pre-hospital emergency medicine, and I was very lucky where I grew up as a junior doctor. There was something called the West Midlands Care Team, which was put together by a chap called Sir Professor Keith Porter, which was a voluntary car-based platform where you could give some of your time on a Friday or Saturday night or on a Sunday during the day, and other doctors would give them their time, and nurses and paramedics would train you in the fundamentals of pre-hospital emergency medicine. So that's where I set out from, and I'm incredibly grateful for that.
What would you do during those sorts of training sessions then? Sorry, just give me an understanding.
So it was, much of it was training by doing. So there was a simulation aspect to it. So we'd talk through cases or simulate cases, and we'd have a monthly education meeting. But actually, most of it, I guess, was learned on the job. So we took our established emergency medicine or anaesthetic or critical care skill set, which we'd gained in hospital, and then were taught how to tailor that to the pre-hospital environment. And you got in a car, you were there with a paramedic, you were there with an experienced pre-hospital doctor and an experienced pre-hospital nurse, frequently from a military background, and you learnt by doing. So you saw, you learnt scene safety, you learnt approach to patients, you learnt about packaging, hypothermia mitigation, and of course about patients injured in motor vehicle collisions.
Was there any consideration, I'm sure there was, but to what extent was the consideration to begin to integrate yourselves with other services like the police or the fire service to try and get things like what we now see as GESIP and interagency working? I don't want to go down too far down this rabbit hole. We'll come back in a second, I promise. But I just want to understand the background of this work, because now it's obviously very clear, and you're making some really active steps to bring that collective understanding and that collective knowledge base up. But what was it like back then?
So to be honest, I still don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be in terms of collaborative, multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary training and working together. So GESIP has gone a long way towards that. I know in certain parts of the country there's really good kind of pockets of excellent practice where this mutual working, this mutual exploring of common themes is there. But I think generally in the UK,
I think that usually comes off the back of one passionate individual, though, doesn't it? It's not necessarily a collective drive from particular services or areas. It's usually just, like I was just sort of alluding to, there's a ambulance station across the road from the fire station that I was at for a couple of years, and it was blind luck that I got stationed there and started actively walking across the road and just inviting them round to do stuff. But it wasn't something that necessarily came from senior management, despite how obvious it may. And I'm not saying, I'm sure, like you said, lots of people do it in the UK. I'm nothing special, but it hadn't been as much of a strategic direction that I'd seen the emergency services working in. We can be quite bad at working in silos, can't we?
Yeah, and I think there's various. You could justify that in various ways. Pre-hospital, particularly paramedics, get a very limited training budget, and I don't mean from a money point of view, because it's almost zero from a money point of view, but in terms of time.
Is it once every 6 weeks or something like that?
I think it's even less than that in some services. So I think some services are getting a couple of days a year. And that includes.
Sorry, I'm thinking of the heart teams. The heart teams is once every 6 weeks. I think it is.
Yeah, the heart teams get much more experience and training and the opportunity for multidisciplinary work, as they're meant to cross over, aren't they, between those multidisciplinary facets. But generally, I think the opportunity to train together and work together and, if you like, surface these problems and talk them through. Is extremely limited, and I'm really grateful for the support of UKRO and the National Fire Chiefs Council and the College of Paramedics and the Faculty of Prehospital Care, because really, we've not worked together in this way many times before, and it takes significant effort to do so. But I really hope it's a building block from which we can kind of springboard for, because one of the key outcomes from the exit project is, there's stuff there that we need to do together. We need to share the same nomenclature. We need to share the same approach. We need to have the same basis for how we care for our patients. And if we don't, we're still going to end up standing at opposite sides of the wreck, working in silos, unfortunately, and that's not good for our patients.
Yeah, and just slowly having that inner frustration because the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing, and with that comes people's inner casting of, they don't know what they're doing, or nobody's listening, or where have they seen this, or where have they seen that. And I've seen some wonderful things at UKRO, but if you'd have put them live into an incident in certain parts of the UK, some people would have been astonished or flabbergasted, or, just like movement of vehicles, prior to any form of extrication or stabilization or anything like that. Some people were horrified by the thought of it, but maybe that's something we're going to get into. So how did you herd those 4 enormous cats into working together, and what was the sort of origin of this?
Yeah, I think if we take a step back, so we've all been to lots of extrications, and I've been lucky. I've attended a number of fire and rescue extrication training courses and done my team leader course and those bits and pieces, and been lucky to offered that opportunity by the fire and rescue services I've worked with in the past. And to me, it just kind of what I was seeing in my job as a pre-hospital emergency doctor and as someone working in a major trauma centre in terms of injury pattern didn't fit with the way that we are extricating. So the term that we've used in the exit project is absolute movement minimization as a principle for extrication. And, we see it historically, but we still see it now. The training where, you bang on the bonnet so that the patient looks directly forwards. You only approach from the front of the car. The rigorous attention to absolute stabilization, training with a glass of water on the dash, and if you spill something, you've done it wrong.
Yeah,
and that has been the focus over the time, rather than perhaps things like entrapment time. And so it didn't make sense to me that I was seeing people with horrible chest injuries, horrible splenic injuries, actively bleeding, horrible pelvic injuries from their entrapment. And they were spending time in a vehicle, which was killing them.
Yeah.
And I was seeing so few patients with spinal cord injuries, which is the focus of this movement minimization techniques, that it just didn't add up. And we started to explore that. And we put together a project, which is called the Exit Project, Extrication in Trauma, which looks at what we do post-collision with these patients. And effectively what we did is we broke that project down in different stages. The first stage was, what does the evidence tell us? So we worked with a librarian, which sounds very boring, but it's exactly the right way to go.
Well, you've got to be, mate. When you're operating at that level, and even some of the stuff that I get involved in now, you can't just speak passionately about something. I want to see the data, and I want to see that it's verified. I want to see where you've got it from, because people just spout things out their arse, and that's how we got into some challenges in the past. You had somebody with the biggest salary and the loudest voice in the room, and that was the direction that we went in, and it wasn't always evidence-based.
Well, when it comes to extrication, I don't think it's ever been evidence-based. So we looked at thousands of resources from developed areas of extrication practice. And what was really interesting to me, so my bias starting off on this project was I assumed that cars, like, I know because I've done this for 15 or so years, and cars used to be rubbish, didn't they? So you'd go to a Mini and people would be absolutely broken in that car because there was no safety systems. They'd be broken in all sorts of horrible ways.
Yeah,
and my assumption
no reinforced bars or anything like that. The whole thing was wrecked, and it was just wrapped around them. The center consoles collapsed down on them. There's so many things to overcome. Whereas now that central safety zone is usually pretty well sustained.
Yeah. And so my bias was, I thought, you know what? spinal injuries used to be a big thing, and movement minimization developed because spinal injuries used to be a massive issue. And then we got seatbelts and crumple zones and central safety zones and reinforcement and proper, safety focused car design. And now, and that's, from the 70s onwards, effectively. And that's affected the cars we've seen on the roads. And therefore, that's affected the patients that I'm seeing. And then perhaps just extrication techniques haven't caught up with that yet in terms of dropping the movement minimization and perhaps focusing on time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's been so many leaps in vehicle technology in general, especially with SRS, and so many, and electric vehicles is a typical example, whilst it's not necessarily built around safety, and just how we are operating with such prehistoric data and systems around the way we believe cars to have been constructed. It doesn't correlate to where we are now, and we're finding that electric vehicles are just one of the things that's really caught us out, because we realized we have not kept up to speed with things. But you're absolutely right, the SRS system hasn't actually made its way down into the fundamentals of how we develop that initial team approach either now.
But what was absolutely fascinating for me is when we dug into the data. So there's actually reasonable data around from the 60s and 70s. Spinal injuries or spinal cord injuries have never been a major cause of morbidity and mortality from motor vehicle collisions.
Well, no, morbidity and mortality, definitely not. But I think their argument, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, so please challenge me because I know you will, is life-changing injuries is the big concern with the spinal injury, isn't it?
Yeah. So life-changing injuries are important. So there's various issues with the historical data set, whichever way you look at it.
That's the beautiful thing about data.
Data collection has got better over time. But what was really interesting for me was, so I've got a collection of FRS reports and manuals from the 60s up to current day. And you can clearly map out in the 60s and 70s, injuries were considered equally. So when you pick up those manuals, they say patients are dying of head injuries, chest injuries, abdominal injuries, and pelvic injuries. And some of those patients need to be handled gently because they might have spinal cord injuries. So that's in the 60s and 70s. And then by the 90s, we see this emergence of absolute movement minimization. And the headline in every one of those manuals from the 90s onwards is about cord injury and absolute movement minimization. And if you look at the data and map it over time, that's inexplicable. There's no change in the frequency of cord injury.
Is it somebody making a massive killing with stab fast and bloody step shocks? Has it all been fueled by somebody trying to sell some gear? I don't know.
So I think it goes back to what you brought up before, that we've relied on individual experts with individual expertise to help us make decisions in this arena, and they've not always made those decisions with the best evidence and done it in a way which engages with all the evidence out there. And that's why we took a step back from this, and we don't want to repeat that error. So there's an OHP at the National Fire Training Centre in Moreton and Marsh from the 90s, which says the fire and rescue service have killed more people than they've saved through the mishandling of the cervical spine. Ooh. So imagine if you're attending your trauma course as a firefighter and an emergency medicine consultant, someone like me, is telling you this as a fact. That's going to affect how you approach every single patient and every single rec that you go to. And I can tell you without a shred of doubt that isn't a fact. And it's perhaps made up is too strong, but it was a belief which wasn't based on any founding in evidence. And so that was the first thing we did with the Exit Project, is we opened our minds to the automotive literature, to the medical literature, to the spinal rehabilitation literature, to the fire and rescue literature, government documents, really interesting old stuff from the States when they did some really excellent work in the 60s around this, scientific technical reports. And we brought all that together and we said, is there an evidence base for the justification of movement minimization response? And the answer to that is a conclusive no. So People now, and we'll come on to this, die of head, chest, and abdominal injuries, and sometimes pelvic injuries. Mm-hmm. Every data set I've looked at in every country, across every decade, people die of head, chest, and abdominal injuries, and sometimes pelvic injuries. And that hasn't changed. So when there is a transfer of energy to a patient, which leads to severe injury, that is the pattern that we see, regardless of safety systems, regardless of airbags, regardless of
vehicle type
safety
or
zones.
environment.
When that energy is transferred to a patient, that is the pattern that we see. And cord injuries, the spinal cord injury, the bit that we worry about from a movement minimization perspective, has always been a very small proportion of patients. And it'd be all right if those patients weren't dying and time critical. It'd be all right that we focused on that very small proportion of the population. But the fact that we've made our priority that movement minimization above perhaps things which are more important like time, that's wrong, because we're causing harm.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been there so many goddamn times, and I've probably only seen it in the last maybe 8 years, and it's usually come from people such as yourself, flying doctors and people working solely in a car. Who I remember first seeing it like 8-9 years ago when I was just a crew commander at the time, and my watch commander was very reluctant to have a certain individual moved, and they'd started collaring them and putting a KED on them. It was a very minor impact on the near side of the vehicle, and the flying doctor turned up and literally just walked over, opened up the door and said, and I'm sure you've done it a million times, "Do you think you can get out?" And they just said, "Yeah," and out they stood. And it was you could almost see that boiling frustration, and it did surface itself in the debrief when
it feels like heresy.
My watch commander at the time stepped aside and challenged the individual on this and said they were going to put some sort of report in. I think it was more ego than anything else, but for some people it does feel that way because it goes against what they'd been taught from people with the best of intentions who they highly respected. And like you said, we need to be the experts in rescue, but when it comes to the multiplicity and all that sort of jazz of the individual and the injuries, we have to be submissive and work together with you, the experts on scene, as to what is the best guided route out of that vehicle given their condition. And I don't think that's always been the case, because there was always a bit of a debate around primacy incidents and who's in charge in the inner cordons and complaints about different differentiations in PPE and all this sort of jazz, and it kind of got lost amongst the noise and took our focus off the casualty centered rescue.
Yeah, and I think every time we have conversations like this, that's what we need to come down to is there is a patient, there is a casualty trapped in that vehicle. How do we give them the best experience and give them the best chance of their physical and psychological recovery from this incident? And that's what we focused on in the
So once you'd accumulated all this,
I'm going to challenge you slightly in that I think you implied that there should be a slightly submissive
is the wrong word. Yeah,
between
right,
fire and rescue, and this needs to be genuinely collaborative with the patient's interests at their focus. And we will bring expertise from the rescue services and expertise from the clinical service to support people in making the right decisions for that patient. But the only way you can make the right decisions is by having the right information, and that's what we've been doing.
Well, what I think I tried to articulate and did so incorrectly is when it comes to just the phrase subject matter expert is probably what I'm alluding to. If we were at a chemical incident, we would be more receptive to the subject matter expert, which would be the individual specializing in that. When it comes to the casualties' physical conditions and what effects we're going to have on that in the method of extrication that we choose, the primary person to seek guidance from would be yourself. Versus, sometimes it's hard as well because you guys work alone so much of the time. Maybe you have a driver with you, not necessarily yourself, but obviously a standard paramedic, and I say standard with in the highest of respect. It's them, and then it's 6 or 8 firefighters. Do you know what I mean? And you're trying to jump in with all of your kit, and you're trying to get a bit of assistance, usually from one of ours who will be delegated as casualty care. But you've got to quickly establish yourself confidently on the scene to be able to work collaboratively. Otherwise, the fire service and incident command, we have a tendency we're very good at command and control, so we swamp the incident with people. And again, it can be hard to see the forest through the noise.
I think that's where we need to step back. So there is no doubt that in areas of the country there is pockets of excellent practice, and there's some excellent practitioners out there, both from the rescue services, both firefighters and paramedics. But the problem is the generally accepted principles of what we're trying to achieve are misaligned and incorrect. And that's why, and we'll come on to it, but that's why we engaged with the NFCC and UKRO and the College of Paramedics and the faculty, because it's only by having shared principles and shared goals that we can get this right. Otherwise, you've got half the people saying, "What are you doing, you crazy person? You've just asked them to step out." And you've got the other half saying, "Oh, this is the right thing to do." And that's going to vary from firefighter to firefighter to paramedic. What we need to do is make sure that every one of our patients is getting the best care that they can do. And we need to do that by creating a framework of shared principles and allowing people to practice that best care rather than it being snuck around the edges or considered, the wrong thing by a majority of practitioners, or perhaps an unsupported thing. They know it's right in their hearts. And that's what a lot of firefighters said to me recently. He said, "I really believe in this, but I'm just not supported by
you know what, mate? I see
national operations guidance or what I've been taught or the trauma course or whatever it might be." And I have paramedics saying the same to me, saying, "I really believe this, but I'm not sure my medical director will support it." And actually, what we need to, and that's why we've done this, and we've tried to be as comprehensive as possible. There's 9 peer-reviewed publications there. There's a load of work gone into this to make sure that we've got the strongest evidence base, the strongest platform to enable the right patient care, which we all believe
100%.
in.
And I see that same uprising currently, just to digress, with some of the national framework around water incidents, where, you go to some stuff and you're like, oh God, we all know the right thing to do, but the policies and procedures stop us from enacting in the way that we believe to be the right case. And there's nothing worse, like I said, than a road traffic collision when the public are standing around thinking, "What are you doing? What are you doing? That's my loved one in there." And time is ticking, and we all know about this, the chain, the survival chain, and all that sort of stuff, and the golden hour, and all those old principles, which some of us which are still relevant. But I also think this is a really perfect time to be having this conversation, because I don't know how familiar you are with it, but there is an enormous state of retirement happening across the UK Fire and Rescue Service at the minute. We are recruiting nationally at such a pace. The people that are coming through now will have less of that remnants of that bias, subconscious, more often than not, that's come from that 25 years in the job, and we're going to learn it this way.
Do you know what, Pete? If you've been told for 20 years that moving a patient by a millimetre or two is going to kill them, that's really difficult 100%. To overcome. And it feels like heresy. It feels like someone's lying to you, pulling the wool over your eyes.
Well, it kind of feels like you're just trying to get the job done quickly, but you don't tell anybody what you actually did. If anybody asks you afterwards, you're like, "Oh no, we just did this and kind of got them out as quickly as possible." Well, the common sense approach should be, absolutely, 100%. Versus which would have been, well, what method did you use, and what stabilization did you have in place, and all this sort of jazz. So once you'd gathered this data set, what was the next step forward from there? Because I know you've produced a lot of really reliable media, and I want to get into sort of how you produced it, and also how it's going to be disseminated, not only just through systems like this, but obviously we've mentioned the Fire Service College, UKRO, NFCC. Talk to me about how it came together and what's going to be happening with it.
Okay, so there's this principle of evidence-based medicine, which is taking into account, when we're making a decision about patient care, the evidence base, the patient's values, and the expert consensus. And you need all three in order to come up with with the best thing, the right thing for your patient, for your casualty. So what we did is we explored where the gaps were through the analysis that I've told you about, where we found that there was this big lack of evidence, and we tried to fill in those gaps using the best available methods, if you like. And so there's different sections of the work. So there's 3 papers which focus on the injuries, morbidity, mortality of patients who are trapped. And those 3 papers very broadly are comparing trapped and not trapped patients and describing their injuries and mortality, comparing the difference between males and females with their injury patterns, trapped status and mortality, and then comparing people at different stages of life and comparing younger patients to older patients by decade of life, looking both at their morbidity and mortality but also having a look at their propensity for self-extrication.
I'd be really interested to read them after this, if they're available to be shared with me. I'd love to be able to do some separate episodes and really just go through that data.
So the Road Safety Trust have funded making these papers freely and openly available. They are written in scientific language, but I've tried to make it as accessible as possible. But they're all available. We can put the links
in
QR codes,
in the note for this,
works,
and I'll probably do a couple of episodes just to even bring it even further down with the greatest respect to make it entertaining and accessible enough for firefighters whilst keeping the validity. And I say that with respect, but I mean, and I'm just a knuckle dragging firefighter. But you know what? This comes back, and I'll just reach back for a second before we carry on. Is we make a lot of mistakes in a lot of the UK Fire and Rescue Service where firefighters, with the best of intentions, they're great problem solvers, they're very resourceful, very disciplined, but we get to a point in our careers, and sometimes we get promoted to a point where we step into the realm of expertise, whether that be in accounts, in financing, in human resources, or in research and development, and actually we don't have the background to be able to operate in those fields well enough, and we tend to lean on our own biases, which then become policies and procedures. And this is where, again, I'm just reiterating what you've just said, but this is where we need to start reaching outside of those silos to make sure that we don't suffer from that groupthink.
Yeah, and likewise, I've got a perspective which has been tainted by my medical training and my experience on the working pre-hospitally. I'm not a technical rescue expert, and it's only by bringing those expertise together that actually we can work out what is best for our patient. And I'm hoping, the Exit project, I hope will save lives. I'm pretty convinced it will do.
As long as we can get it out there to all
the
instructors and to
a good patient experience. But also, I think it delivers a framework as to how we can work together. Does that make sense? We've demonstrated that we can do this work, and we can
almost a
work
project
together
flow
across
to say,
discipline.
well, if I wanted to now do this same thing for road rescue, or if I wanted to do it like for water incidents, how would I go about it? Well, I need these types of organizations. We start here, and then we start with this evidence-based approach first. We do our deep dive, we do our librarians, we get our data set, then we find correlating trends. Because like you say, even that, in a previous role, I did a lot of work around, you ever heard things like Kaizen and Six Sigma? You've ever worked into that sort of stuff? Okay.
I've not.
There's some wonderful books about it. But so Kaizen and Six Sigma were all about, they came from production. And it's about complex problem solving, basically. And it's more a method of work utilized more by industry to reduce waste, increase efficiencies, and all that sort of stuff. But more than that is to collaboratively change ways of working in entrenched mindsets within factories and stuff like that, so that the industrial machine can make a lot more money. But the same concept can be applied to any kind of workflow. And you will have unknowingly done things like 5 why exercises and effort reward based metrics and all this sort of stuff, and fishbone analysis and all this sort of silly terminology to be able to work your way through a project like this. But you're absolutely right. It's a great case study as we look more into it, where people can adopt this very same thing, because people have the intentions of doing this sort of stuff, but it's hard, as you will have found yourself, it's hard to get all those ducks in a row.
It certainly is, but but we'll get there, I'm sure. Going back to we work with the Trauma Audit Research Network. That is a scientific academic group based in Manchester, and they have every major trauma unit, every hospital seeing trauma in the UK feeds data up to them. So they have got the biggest database in Europe of people who have got moderate and major injury. And we know everything about them. We know their age, their sex, when they had their operations, what operations they had, and what their outcomes are.
That's the Trauma Audit Research Group. Sorry.
And Trauma Audit Research Network, so TARN. So we work with them to get the data for the 3 papers that I've very briefly described. So what I'm trying to get across is this is world-leading, outstanding data. So when we look at it, we can be pretty sure that it comprehensively captures patients who've got major injury associated with motor vehicle collision. And so what we did is we went back and we looked at those papers. So we compared trapped and not trapped patients. Unsurprisingly, trapped patients were more likely to die and had more severe injuries. We all know that. We know that from our lived experience. So we've seen it. But importantly, once we modelled and used complex computer techniques to take into account people's age, their injuries, their comorbidities, their frailty, everything we knew about them, being trapped was associated with an excess mortality. So an excess mortality beyond the injuries, beyond the age, beyond the background medical history of these patients. So there's something about being trapped which kills you. Now I think that's pretty self-evident to anyone who's been out there and done enough time on the road. But what's important about that is it probably means that it's a modifiable variable. So there's something about entrapment and extrication that leads to an excess mortality. That's horrible, but it's also exciting because it means we can probably do something about it. You can't do anything about people's age. We really can't do anything about people's injuries once they've had that primary insult. You can't do anything about their comorbidities or their frailty, but you can do something about their entrapment status, the time that they're trapped for, the treatment that we deliver in cars, and that excess mortality is hopefully
Can I ask you to
modifiable.
debunk a myth, whilst we're just there, because I think it relates to what we're speaking about now. Because when we hear the word entrapment, something I've seen surface many a times, and I think is just people getting their wires crossed a little bit. When people hear entrapment, they can very quickly get caught up with what people will commonly know as sort of harness entrapment, and if people are trapped for more than 15 minutes, then we need to wait for longer because the buildup of toxins and all of this sort of stuff. I think, and please, again, you just go off on this wherever you feel is most relevant or discard it completely. There's an over-focus on the extent of entrapment and the morbidity rate that could be caused by the release of X number of toxins. And I don't think there's much crossover there, but I know that it's something that gets spoken about and again affects people's sort of interest in expediting and extrication. Can you just kind of talk around that for a second, or debunk it, or tell me I'm talking waffle?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in suspension trauma or crush trauma, but I've obviously dealt with many patients in both categories over the time and know people who certainly have that degree of expertise. I think much of our historic approach, similar to our historic approach to extrication, which we're looking to change, has been based on expert opinion that hasn't been informed by evidence. And I think one of my key takeaways from the Exit Project is actually human beings, when they're untrained, probably know what to do. And if you hadn't heard all this bullshit about don't move anyone, don't touch anyone, if a loved one of yours was squished in a car wreck, you'd try and get them out.
Some of the best ones I've seen.
That would be your human reaction, and that's the right reaction. And more, we're seeing. Another key outcome from the Exit Project, and it's not rare within the science, but one of my main takeaways is the more the patient does for themselves, the better. So if you imagine if I break your arm now, and then I move your arm across your desk or across your mic, that's really going to hurt you. If you do it, you know exactly how to move it to cause you the least amount of pain. And that pain is a good marker of biomechanical aggravation.
People find their natural comfortable
so
position,
you're going to cause
we
yourself...
try and come in, grab hold of them and go, I'm just going to put it in this sling, I'm going to put you in that position, and they fucking scream. They go, they're fine how they are. Some of the best people I've seen with this.
So I think human beings are good at survival. Those natural instincts are probably correct, and if you're trapped, don't be trapped. Get people out as soon as they can do.
So take us into how it's formulating itself into some of the procedures and stuff, some of the things that are available on the UKRO website, and where people can start accessing these, I suppose.
So I think we've talked about those first 3 papers. You're right. We're not going to be able to do them justice today. I really encourage.
I'll contact you after this and try
access them and do a deep dive, and we'll find some time. But I think one of the key things that I want to say, and someone put it to me fantastically the other day, so I'm going to steal the way they put it. But if you take the percentage of patients who we extricate who have got spinal cord injury and round it to who've got isolated spinal cord injury and no other time critical injuries, and round it to the nearest whole number, that percentage is 0.
Wow. Jesus.
And all the rest of them, the other, it's 0.3%. I'm trying to make the point in a powerful
No,
way.
you're absolutely right.
0.7% have got a cord injury. More than half of those have got another associated time-dependent injury. So it's around about 0.3 and a smidge percent of these patients have got an isolated cord injury. And to be honest, I think you'll know who they are because they'll have signs of that cord injury. The other 99.6 whatever percent, they've got other time-dependent injuries, whether it be their chest or their abdomen or their pelvis. They've got other stuff going on. And regardless of the fact whether they've got a cord injury or not, the way we look after the cord injury is we need to maintain perfusion, so blood pressure. We need to get blood there. We need to get waste products away, and we need to get oxygen there. And you know what? If you've got a horrible chest injury, you can't get oxygen in. If you've got a horrible abdominal injury, you're hypoperfused because all your blood is now sloshing around your abdomen. Yeah. So that's terrible for your cord injury. And that's why the amount of patients who could benefit from movement minimization, and we'll come on to why they don't, but could benefit from movement minimization is tiny. Round to the nearest number, it's 0% of the patients we extricate. So
all roads lead to expediting this process.
They do. So the second bundle of work, so that's 3 papers looking at the injuries, morbidity and mortality of different groups of patients. And we could deep dive into those. And there's some really interesting things around difference between males and females, really interesting things associated with age, but we'll park that. The second work we did was looking at the biomechanical, so the movements associated with current extrication techniques. And there's 4 papers there, what we did is we took healthy volunteers, and this is a problem. So if you imagine, I couldn't get people with acute spinal cord injury because they're very, very few, and they're not going to drag themselves to, and I'm really grateful to the support of all the fire and rescue services and all the firefighters who made this stuff happen. I can't drag them to a rescue centre and cut them out of a car. So we used healthy volunteers because it was the best model for the numbers that for doing this science well. You can't use a pig because you can't get a piggy cervical spine collar, and you can't get a piggy-sized car to cut them out of and have piggy extrication techniques. So, we're left with healthy volunteers. But what we did is we used a range of healthy volunteers. So we've got, our youngest volunteers were in their 20s, and our oldest were in their 70s. We've got a range of BMIs. We've got a range of males and a range of females. And all the studies we did were what are called powered. So you can do a scientific calculation to make sure that the answer you get is powerful enough to be considered proper science. So if you can imagine, if I extricated someone twice, that's probably not going to be very powerful. Yeah. But if I do it 400 times or 1,000 times, that means that Pete, reading these results can put more credibility into it. And there's a way that you can calculate that in advance of doing your science, so that you can say your study is powered. So these 4 studies are all powered. They're all using healthy volunteers, and they're considering different bits of modern day extrication practice. And I think the key paper to look at, if you're going to focus on one, is one which compares 4 different extrication techniques. And it compares self-extrication to a rapid extrication, which was just opening the door, sliding a spinal board under the bottom and then rotating the patient out with a 4 firefighter team and then taking them out gently, a B-post rip and a traditional roof-off extrication. Okay. I fully appreciate that nomenclature varies nationally and internationally.
B-post rip is a pig ugly procedure. It's rarely ever done.
I love it.
If done well, it's great, but you have to really be quite proficient. It's done very well at UKRO, and I'm sure with the individuals that you work with are probably people that gravitate towards this work because they are good at it.
And I think that's the issue. There's some brilliant expertise out there, but when you look at the multidisciplinary training opportunity for paramedics on the front line, or your retained firefighter working in rural Devon, the training opportunity is just not as good as we need it to be if we want someone to become proficient in a B post rip and patient assessment, for example. But so anyway, so we got these patients, these volunteers, we covered them with spinal motion sensors, and then we extricated them hundreds of times. kind of in summary, a non-scientific summary, but it paints a picture. And what we found is, we could report movement, and we could report all sorts of movements. So flexion, extension, yaw, rotation, many different things. But all the graphs at the end look the same. And what we found is the least movement by a large amount was associated with self-extrication.
Really?
And all the other techniques were near identical.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's so controlled, isn't it? Because you're obviously in control of your own movements, and people aren't moving you in an unprepared manner.
Yeah. So we've got, so rapid was the same as roof off, which was the same as B post rip in terms of spinal movement. Yeah. So if spinal movement is important to you, and the previous papers perhaps say it's less important than we thought it was, or at least I hope I've made that clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then modern extrication techniques, and these were applied by many different firefighters in different locations around the country across many tens of volunteers, many thousands of times.
How long did this take?
It's taken years. It's taken a long time. But so these techniques don't perform as expected. So if you'd asked me before, what do I think a firefighter's perception? And I can't have a firefighter's perception. I'm not a firefighter, but I have been told and taught when I've attended extrication courses that the gold standard is something like a roof off technique, and then perhaps B post rip is a second best, and rapid. That's for special reserve situations.
Most people gravitate to the golden extrication. They like to keep the whole, neutral spine alignment, straight out the back. Everybody climb on it. Blah blah.
Yeah. So but do you know what? We've collected data prospectively at real world extrications, hundreds of them now. So real life extrications, prospectively collected data. The average time for a roof off technique is about 32 minutes.
It takes a while.
So I know we'll all say it takes half of that, but it doesn't. It doesn't. Whereas a rapid X, you could achieve that in 90 seconds of arrival. Yeah. And if it's got the same movement associated with it, why wouldn't you do the rapid X every time?
Because I think people enjoy using the tools. I'm just going to be honest with you. People learn this stuff at training school, and then they go, yeah, let's do all the stuff, because that's really cool. I like doing all the stuff. I like resipping the blooming windscreen, and I like doing all my cuts, and I like doing all my peel and reveal. But it is just so time consuming. Yeah.
And Pete, that would be fine if people weren't dying.
Yeah, that's the problem. And we all write it off and go, well, we did the best we could. Yeah, we did do the best we could, but we're singing from the wrong hymn sheet.
So, I completely appreciate, I'm the same. I've put a lot of time and effort into getting a specific skill set, which, when patients are very sick, I get to apply. And the more times I apply that, the better I will be. And I get a satisfaction from doing my job well. However, when it comes to extrication, we need to accept that this is all about delivering the very best outcomes for our patients. Yeah. And that might mean using our tools less. I'm not taking away, no, some of these patients will need immediate space creation. Some of them will need releasing. We are going to need that technical rescue expertise. There's no doubt about it, because those patients exist.
But that's a smaller number of incidents. I mean, when you look on the UKRO website, that's when we're talking about LGV collapsed on top of another vehicle, and you need to ram this, and you need to cut that, and you need to do all of that. But that is a small percentage.
It's about 10%. We've done. It's about 10% of patients will need some degrees of space creation. And then we need to talk about how then we maintain that skill set, don't we? If we're using it less, but that's perhaps for another day. So we've got papers which say. So another really interesting thing which I missed, actually, I'm just going to park the biomechanical analysis, go back to those first papers. One of the things that came out was that if you look at the patients who lived and the patients who died very rapidly, their clinical observations were so near identical to not be able to tell the difference between the groups.
Now, are these clinical observations? I'm staying on the same course of thought, I promise. Are they coming from the clinicians that go that attended the incident, or are they also coming
It's
from
the first recorded paramedic set
Yeah,
of
because
clinical
I think a
observations.
lot of people the most of the fatalities I've been to, and this is by no means a dig at the NHS or anything like that, are instances where just through lack of resource, and again, my brother-in-law's a paramedic, I've done many ride-alongs, so there is almost non-stop
Yeah.
through an entire 12-hour shift, so it's not through lack of desire, people aren't sitting in lay-bys, but in my own very, very biased, small evidence base of whatever, 15 years, people have died before the paramedics have got there because we've attempted a rapid something or other, and we're trying to work on them on the roadside, and that's just a bad series of events, I'm sure.
So we excluded patients. So TIAN excludes patients who die before they get to hospital. Okay. And so what we're talking about is, for me, there's probably two groups of patients. There's those who are really sick, where clinical observations aren't particularly useful, because you can tell from the end of the car that they're really sick, because they're pale and they're clammy, and you put their hand on their pulse and they haven't got one, or they're not conscious. Those patients are really sick, and they're obviously really sick to me, to you, to a passerby. Everyone knows. You know, you get your hair stand up at the back of your neck. You get that holy fuck feeling. You know,
the deck is stacked against you. You're like, oh fuck it.
Yeah, and
then I'm going to do here.
And then you've got the rest. And in that rest is everyone who is uninjured, minorly injured, moderately injured, severely injured, but not peri-dead, okay? Clinical observations don't help you distinguish between that group. So the ones who are really sick, we all know are really sick. Clinical observations probably aren't useful because we can all see that they're really sick. And then those who are about to become really sick, the clinical observations don't help you. So you can't predict. So this idea that, you know, and I've been around this conversation several times and made this error myself. The clinical observations are stable. We've got time with this one. That idea is wrong, because you can't predict what the next 10 minutes are going to do, and the clinical observations aren't useful in doing that.
Do you think, and I know I'm jumping forward, but only for a second, then we'll come back. I'm thinking, and I'm hopeful, and maybe you're going to come to it further down the conversation, this is where we are going to have to totally remap our entire, you know, I mean, of course, we've come across A and B plans and stuff like that. We probably need to scrap that altogether, because like you say, we start to walk ourselves down this sense of safety and delusion where we're like, and exactly as you just articulated, we've got time with this one, let's go for the best, slowest route out. That should never be the case, really, should it?
Well, no. So, and one of the key outcomes from the exit project is that we should move from a focus on movement minimization to a focus on time. Because patients are either so sick that they need to come out quickly, and we can't predict if they're going to deteriorate or not, or they're so well, which coming out quickly isn't going to cause them any harm because of the biomechanical data that we've produced. So the idea of a movement focused, there might be a tiny group. So the 0.3% of patients who have got a clear spinal injury and very clearly no other injury, they might need something special. I suspect they don't actually from the biomechanical data, but they need separate consideration by experts in that area. But the other 99.6% of patients, they probably need to come out quickly. And that's the finding. So moving on. So we filled in some of the problems around data. We filled in some of the problems around what movements were associated with extrication. I said there's 4 papers, and we've looked at all sorts of collars, no collars. We even did chain cabling to kind of appeal to our Scandinavian German colleagues who are into that. So we've done all of that, and self-extrication is superior. There's no doubt about it. And then the other paper that we did looks at patient experience. So we interviewed patients who'd been extricated, and we worked with the Devon Air Ambulance patient liaison clinicians to identify those patients, and also Aspire, which is a spinal injuries charity.
I've seen them.
Because we wanted to make sure that patients with cord injuries were represented. So, we wanted to make sure that we were kind of benefiting from this wide array of experiences, including people who had cord injuries who were extricated. And I would really implore you, it makes quite difficult reading, and actually listening to it was even more difficult. we think, or at least I thought going into this, it would be about the noise of the extrication, and perhaps we need to use goggles more frequently because people are scared by glass knocking around, and perhaps we need to, I don't know, wrap patients up because it's cold at night when in the British winter, and it wasn't any of that. It was all about communication and explanation.
Yeah,
and patients had a good experience. If someone held their hand, told them what was going on in language that they understood and was kind to them. And patients had a bad experience if they were treated like a sack of potatoes effectively, and people talked over them and didn't use their name. And one of the strong outcomes from that was the importance of this extrication buddy. And I think the fire rescue services do this really well. So putting someone in the vehicle.
But when we do our initial training, as I've experienced at several services across the UK, so much of it is based around functional skills first, and the emotional intelligence or the empathy side of it tends to come in later. But I think you're right, and we've seen a lot of advances in trauma care in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. So as we upskill on that side of it, I'm optimistic that this will remain a core part of it.
And do you know what? Like we're very fortunate at our RMs. We've got patient liaison clinicians who follow up our patients. You know, they don't go, "Oh, Tim Nutbeam, he was wonderful. He used the latest edition of painkillers on me," or you know what? He decompressed my chest with skill and attention. Yeah. They go, I felt really looked after because he held my hand and told me what was going on.
And without seeming too wishy-washy, I'll bet there is a strong correlation, if that data set were to be analysed, into that person's physiological reaction to that fear of the unknown, to their anxiety, to their, the way their body reacts to that trauma, if they do have somebody alongside them, explaining it to them step by step.
So what was one of my strong takeaways from this was, I work 50% of my time in the pre-hospital environment. I go to extrications pretty frequently as part of that, and I see injured people every day in my various roles when I'm working clinically. And it becomes normal. It's normal for me to see someone who's had this smash or that crash or whatever it might be, and they've got this horrible injury here or that horrible injury there. We forget, I think, sometimes just what a life-changing experience it is for that patient. God, yeah. So it might be our second extrication of the day, or we might be on, a run of 5 shifts, and it's, it's another extrication. But actually, for that patient there, this is a big deal and a life-changing experience.
Whilst they're sat there petrified, they're thinking, "Am I ever going to work again? I can't take my kids to school. What's my partner going to say? I've ruined the car. How are we going to get to work the next few weeks?" And they are their life is falling apart. This is the worst day of their life.
Yeah, and interestingly, one of the things which came out was there's an innate fear of fire as well. So many people said in that immediate post-collision phase, and I don't know whether we've propagated that through, the TV, the car hits.
We see on social media, car caught fire. I think it's less than 3% of RTCs actually caught fire.
Deep human innate fear of fire, whichever it might be, people are petrified of that. And being able to hold their hand and say, "You know what, I'm here to look after you. This car isn't going to set on fire. We're going to keep you safe. I'm going to talk you through the next steps." I think that's invaluable. And we talk a lot about physical recovery, and I've made that mistake today. I've talked about morbidity and mortality and broken bones and broken chests. Actually, this is about giving people their optimum outcome, and that includes the psychosocial aspect. So there's no point having a brilliantly set, not dying from your chest injury if you've had a terrible psychological experience and that spoils your life. So actually getting this holistic bundle of care, minimizing entrapment time, working together for a bespoke solution, and caring for that patient beyond the clinical, that is where we need to work together, and we will give our patients the very best chance.
God, I love that. This is strong, brother. Really, really strong. Mate, it is. So honestly, I feel like I'm envisaging people hearing this, and I'm like, God, it excites me, really excites me, because I think at the minute, and I hope you'll prove me wrong, like the people benefiting from this are the most are those small number of individuals who are most passionate about it. But this needs to be at the core of, stuff that's happening in services, stuff that's at the Fire Service College, stuff that's at UKRO, and you just giving so much of your time to disseminate and propagate this message is so vital. But sorry, please carry on. Hey folks, just wanted to jump in with a quick piece around firefighter health and wellbeing. Now we get a lot of messages and emails into the podcast around firefighter health and fitness, whether you are trying to join the fire service and pass them tricky fitness tests, if you are currently serving, or if you are coming up to that next chapter of your life, retiring from the emergency services. We get so many different questions around it. So in partnership with Fitness for the Frontline, we have come up with a series of guidance and programs specifically designed to reflect the physical elements of the role of a firefighter. So whether it's carrying an LPP across an overgrown field, lifting a ladder above your head under running it, or wrestling with cutting gear for 30 plus minutes at some kind of complicated RTC, our bodies are required to lift, push, and carry objects in very specific circumstances. That is effectively what Fitness on the Frontline focuses on, as well as the longer term aspects of overall health and wellness for our firefighters. There are focuses around strength endurance, and overall conditioning, all achievable and relevant to our roles. Now, we are definitely not about to be smashing out world records or getting that beach body ready in 6 weeks rubbish. The systems and programs that we put in place are adjusted for people's current fitness levels, and they're not a prescriptive weight or a one-size-fits-all BS. We also take into consideration all the fitness testing for initial application and also for current firefighters who want to maintain and progress their fitness levels. It is very likely for myself personally that I'm still going to be a firefighter when I'm 60 plus, so longevity in the role is really important to me, and I know it is for so many people out there. The system has a built-in ability to adjust easily depending on the equipment you have available, your fatigue levels, or if you're coming off busy ass night shifts and you haven't got a lot of time to work out. You can record your results, log your weights, your body measurements. We've got all the facilities to do that. The system is yours to use how you want to train. We've taken all the fluff and the gimmicks and the BS away from most of the rubbish that you see out there. And this is designed by experienced operational firefighters and qualified people, including myself, with members of the team available to contact throughout the time you are within us in the program. If you ever get stuck, if you're starting to struggle, and also to celebrate those wins and achievements with you. It all starts with no obligation, 7 days worth of the programming, absolutely free. So whether you're joining, serving, or looking at the next chapter in your life, have a glance in the link for the podcast. Fitness for the Frontline is designed by firefighters for firefighters. Now back to the show.
So if you imagine now, we've talked about, we've got some data, 3 patients talking about injuries and excess mortality with entrapment and a low rate of spinal cord injury. Yep. We've got some data which says extrication techniques don't perform as we thought they did, and self-extrication is biomechanically far superior to anything that we do. All other extrication techniques are much of a muchness. And we've got some data from patients saying, please treat me with love and attention, hold my hand, be my companion, and tell me what's going on. There's other stuff in there around not taking photos and liaison with family, but you know, some strong themes. What we did then is, if you imagine, so right at the start, I talked about evidence-based medicine, and I talked about relevant scientific evidence. So we filled in those gaps. We talked about patient experience, which is the last paper that we've discussed. And then I talked about expert consensus. And that's what we did. So we took all the historic evidence. So right from the start, when I was saying, you know, we found all those firefighter manuals and all that stuff around automotive design and all that stuff around entrapment and injury. And then we took the new evidence that we had produced around patient injuries and different groups and the biomechanical work. And we took the patient experience work and we made that all available to a group of subject matter experts. This is a scientific process called a Delphi consensus. The Delphi was, you know, it's an old Greek myth around the oracle of all knowledge. And what you do is you recruit a group of SMEs, subject matter experts, and you allow those subject matter experts to interact anonymously from each other. So they're not, so it's not power. It's not the professor speaks loudest. It's not the heavy rescue person speaks loudest. It's they interact anonymously, and you use them to consider evidence and come out with consensus statements. So what we did is we wanted to be, what I didn't want to do was recruit all my mates from fire and rescue backgrounds and clinical backgrounds, because they think the same as me. Right? And actually, I'm not going to benefit from the varied perspectives which comes from all these different backgrounds. So we approached groups like the College of Paramedics, like UKRO, like NFCC, and some at the Faculty of Prehospital Emergency Care and some pre-hospital research groups. And we said, you select 10 people from who represent a kind of a wide viewpoint within your organization, and they will be our SMEs. So that there was this degree of separation between me running the study and the SMEs.
Yeah, making it a double-blind study, effectively.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I knew their names, but because they had to submit them in order to actually complete the database. But they effectively then they interact anonymously through an online platform, and they vote on statements. And then some statements get rejected, and some statements get carried. And then because they can free text as well, you get new statements at each round.
Yep.
And effectively, we use that group of 60 subject matter experts to come up with a set of statements. And I think there was, I can't remember, 91, 92 statements in total. And then we took those statements and we summarized them and then worked with the 6 groups, so the faculty, pre-hospital care, college of paramedics, UKRO, NFCC, and the research groups to come up with a set of principles. And then those principles were validated by agreement between all of those groups. So what we've got now is the exit project. You asked me how long it's taken. It's taken years, years and years and years, lots and lots of work. But the output of that is a couple of sides of A4, which take into account the evidence, the historic evidence, the new work that we've done, this agreed subject matter expert consensus, and then the interpretation of those groups with the power. It is NFCC has the power to make national operation guidance changes. The College of Paramedics has the power to influence JR-Calc, who set the standards and guidance for paramedics. The Faculty of Pre-Hospital Care has the power to produce a consensus statement which supports this work. So
now we're at the point where we're going to see that 3 to 5 year culture change as this slowly rolls itself through those processes, through national operational guidance.
Do you know what? The NFCC and the UKRO and the College of Paramedics and JR-Calc, everyone has been brilliant. And do you know what? I think it's because it makes sense, because we've all been there at those recs going, I wish this patient would come out quicker. I can see them getting paler and paler. I wish, and we've seen those patients die. Yeah. Many times, unfortunately. And so it's got the advantage it doesn't cost anything.
Yeah.
So hopefully, it's that helps translate it into practice. But effectively, I've got a meeting with JR-Calc next week, but we've suggested some guidance changes, which they've been very positive around. The Faculty of Pre-Hospital Care working on a consensus statement, which will support this.
Does JR-Calc print every 2 years, or is it every year?
So they do, I think, a print run every 2 years, but now most clinicians access it through an app, which can be updated on a regular basis. Cool. So the latest edition has actually just been printed. But what we are hopeful for, I can't speak in advance of the meeting, but the strong positive vibes I'm getting is that this will be pushed out as an electronic update.
I would imagine it's the same
either later this year or early next year.
NFCC and National Operational Guidance, because all of that is an electronic platform as well.
Yeah. And so NFCC have committed to translate this into NOG with UKRO support.
Beautiful.
UKRO have committed to help distribute this. I'm doing as many translation pieces as I can, and this is part of that puzzle. Getting out to
boots on the ground
to firefighters. Hopefully, boots on the ground. Hopefully, realizing that this is a good thing,
so they can see it coming down the pipe. Because otherwise,
so
often you just see something land on a presentation in front of you and go, "Where the fuck has this come from?" You know what I mean? So this helps people piece that stream together.
Yeah, and what I hope people realise is that we've kind of given this due care and attention. It's not me throwing my weight around and banging a table. Yeah. It's me saying, me and all the people I've worked with say, you know what, we've seen people die. We think we can do something about this. We've seen people have poor outcomes. This is the very best way we've got to assess the evidence going now. It might change in the future, and that'd be brilliant. I hope that we revisit this every year or even more frequently and say, what does the latest evidence tell us? What's the latest injury patterns? What's the latest in car design? What's the latest in tool design? And come together and say, are we still getting this right? But I can tell you what, I genuinely think that we've got it wrong for 50 plus years, in terms of the principles that we based it on.
And it's so crazy that the industry and all of the manufacturers of tools and stuff like that, and I'm not going to point blame at them, but they have invested millions on this doctrine rather than probably spending a lot less money to fund really, really accurate research like this. I mean, there must have been, someone has to have funded this as well, though, because it's taken a colossal amount of a lot of people's time. Is there any acknowledgements that we need to give in terms of funding for this?
I think most people have worked on this project around their job plans, so I'm not being given formal time for it. So my time, Rob Fenwick, who's one of my key co-authors, Mike Dason, who's a firefighter, John O from Seven Centre, all people have given their time for free to make this happen, and I think that's a really good thing. We didn't have a university kind of saying
it
you
is
must
a really
do
good
that,
thing, but it's also a little bit sad. Not like sad as in, you're like really passionate, you're a geek about it.
But the Road Safety Trust, I've got to say, so the Road Safety Trust have funded all the biomechanical aspects of this. So we worked with the University of Coventry, so got their professors in to make sure that we did it well and rigorously and provide all the equipment. Road Safety Trust has funded travel and accommodation, all that stuff to make it happen. And most importantly, it costs money to publish this stuff. Yeah. So to put something out in the journal costs about £2,500. It's a lot of money, and they've paid for that so that when we have these conversations, instead of you going and clicking and reading a summary and hitting a firewall, you can actually see the paper and you can see the data and you can see where it all came from.
It's a big cost, but when you think about the cost of just a fire engine, a paramedic, and someone like yourself attending an incident, we rapidly exceed that. So the cost-benefit argument is really astonishingly simple to try and justify when you look at what's been put into this.
Yep, hopefully so. And it's we've learned a lot along the way, and as I said, hopefully it's a stepping stone for more work like this. I've not got expertise in water rescue, but there's loads of stuff there, or in firefighter physiology. There's loads of stuff there where multidisciplinary working will give us the best outcomes for our patients and our teams.
Yeah, I think we're seeing the big steps of that in terms of carcinogens and effects and chemicals. That's where there's a lot of collective collaborative work going on as well. So take us back to this is finding its way through UKRO, it's finding its way through NFCC, it's finding its way through all of your clinicians and JR Calc. Where can people access this and where are we at in terms of going forward now?
So I think if you want a really quick summary, if you go to the UKRO website, there's a 20-minute video which kind of brings this all together.
I'm going to put that link in the comments for this as well, yeah.
I'll send you a link to that. There's also, if you want to touch on just a couple of papers, I'd recommend probably 3, and that is the patient experience one, just because it's so powerful. Mm-hmm. And then there's the 4 movements of extrication one, just so you can see the rigorous that we apply to self-extrication versus roof off versus B-post rip versus rapid, and you can see that. And then probably the most important one is the final Delphi, where you can see how we interacted with the SMEs, the 92 statements that were produced, and the summary statement box, which has got the principles that we need to take forwards. But I'll make sure you've got all those links. I've got them all those QR codes and stuff as well. So we can get people reading.
Dude, you have been honestly one of the most well put together and articulate guests we've had in quite some time. I think this is going to be such an impactful thing to share. And I'll be totally honest, so often we have to hunt out and try and find these subject matter experts, because I think there's so much value to be heard from, and for people's information, it is yourself that's actually doing the presentation on the UKRO website as well. So they'll get probably not as much data as they've had today, but for those people that perhaps just want to share it with their teams on a training evening, it's certainly a wonderful place to start, and they can then go on and connect the dots between these papers and hopefully what we're going to see manifest through national operational guidance. But again, I just thank you so much for taking time out of your day for this. I don't want to close up without having missed anything. Is there any other areas you think we'd love to explore before we wrap it up?
So I think it's just an appeal to your listeners. So the Exit Project team, we've tried to do the very best that we can do by these sets, with this set of principles. And we've tried to engage and work with as many firefighters as we could and as many stakeholders representing those firefighters. But I can guarantee you, we've not got it right. We've done our best, but we've not got it right. And it's only by ongoing engagement with those boots on the ground that we're going to get it right for our patients and for our teams. So my ask, I guess, is to provide feedback. Tell us what's working. Tell us what isn't. Tell us where you're having issues with training. Tell us how we can help. And and we'll try our best to make this work, because it's really important for our patient outcomes and really important for our teams, so that we're all on that same page.
100%, mate. I always say to people, be an objective contributor rather than just saying, "Oh, well, they haven't thought of that." Right, we'll bring a solution. Lean in. Send that feedback, call, email. Write into the podcast or whatever, and I'll forward it on to Tim and the team or whatever it might be. Don't just be one of those that I always say, don't let perfection be the enemy of good, which to me says, just because something isn't perfect, don't cast it aside. Do you know what I mean? This has been a colossal piece of work, and you've tried to stretch down each tunnel, down each avenue, and through each, person's social structure to try and get all those experts. And if there's somebody, there will be somebody you've missed. There will be many people that've got, I can't believe you never spoke with so-and-so, or you never spoke with this organization. Okay, that's absolutely fine. This is an iterative process. JR Calc and National Operational Guidance are perfect examples of stuff where we are not attaching our names and biases. And because I think they always used to say that science and stuff advances one funeral at a time or something like that, didn't they? Whereby it was the beliefs of a certain individual that would stand until they were gone. And then actually the evidence-based approach could come through. Whereas now I think we have taken away a lot of that pride and ego away from advancing things such as this. And I think that's the way that we're all going to collectively benefit. But it requires people to lean in, even if you're not an expert in your field. If you have some evidence, or if you have something to contribute to it, then lean in, even if it's something that's already been visited. But man, I really, really thank you for taking time out of your day and time out of your profession. I know you're jam-packed with meetings and stuff. So I really appreciate it, my friend.
No worries at all. And hopefully we can come back and have a deep dive into bits of this. And
honestly,
perhaps next year or the year after, we'll work it through.
Really love that. I'll apologise several times. As I get more and more excited, I tend to interrupt. So I notice on my own self-awareness, I have done that a number of times today. So I apologise for that. But please take it as a sincere.
It's very welcome.
As a sincere excitement. As we go, I'll be like, oh God, it connects to this, and my mind has just been, connecting all the threads as I've been listening, and at times unnecessarily interrupting you. But yeah, I've made a whole page full of notes, honestly, from the Delphi consensus to some of the manuals, some of the data sets you've gone into, the patient experience papers, the 3 papers on mortality. And this is stuff that either I'd love for us to maybe do some shorter stuff and go through together, or I'm more than happy to do a read, because that's what I find so much about podcasts these days. It's people want to digest this information, but we live in such a hectic world that if you can translate that into a media where people can listen to it on the move, it becomes so much more digestible and reaches so many more people. So I thank you for being open and brave enough, because also I will say from an academic perspective, it's harder to get some of those introverts who have the real knowledge, such as yourself, to come, because I'd make an absolute clusterfuck of it. Do you know what I mean? I'd do the best that I could, but it only comes from people that have actually got their hands into the data. They've really got down there elbow deep and done the work. So I really thank you for being so open and so confident in coming on and sharing this.
No worries
Beautiful.
at all.
All right, Tim, thank you very much for your time, my friend. Appreciate
Excellent.
it.
Cheers. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Firefighters Podcast is a global podcast seeking to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operators. Through a series of wide-ranging conversations celebrating those within our sector, we seek to encourage and support this incredible group of people. It's brought to you by myself, operational firefighter Pete Wakefield, and I speak with individuals from all walks of life who I sincerely believe can add value to or develop those who have chosen this life path. Please support your emergency services wherever you are in the world, and thank you for listening.